This is the second lecture for EC4202. In the first lecture we started looking at the goals of macroeconomic policy. And we looked at the first goal of macroeconomic policy, which was to increase the living standards of residents of a country. And in this instance, and then we finished up looking at the second objective of macroeconomic policy, which is a low rate of unemployment. And we were looking at some of the aggregate statistics calculated and created by the Central Statistics Office of the labour force in Ireland. Thing we noted at the end was that these statistics are subject to revision over the next 12 months as the CSO incorporate the full results of the census undertaken back in April. So in the census period from 2006, the CSO had essentially been estimating the overall size of the population in Ireland based on deaths which they can measure, births which they can measure, and migration which they have to estimate. And as it turned out, their population estimate was 97,000 lower than the actual population. So the census revealed 97,000 people that weren't in the CSO numbers. So the CSO has to incorporate those. So the CSO carries out a survey, the Quarterly National Household Survey, which provides details on employment and unemployment in Ireland. It's a survey of more than 20,000 people. The CSO then aggregate those figures up to give us the totals. So to show that we have a workforce of just over 2.1 million people, of which 1.8 million are in employment and just over 300,000 are unemployed. Over the next 12 months, it's likely these figures will change as much as patterns in the economy, but also because of revisions by the CSO. What's unlikely to change too much is the unemployment rate, which is around 14.5%. The unemployment rate is the number unemployed, 304,500, divided by the labour force, the total number of people looking for work, 2,125,800. When the revisions do come, it's likely that both of these numbers will increase, the number unemployed and the number in the labour force. So it's not going to have much effect on the unemployment rate, but will have an impact on the totals. If we look at the unemployment rate in Ireland over the past 26-27 years or so, we can see some of the dramatic changes that occurred in line with many of the economic developments in the economy. So here is the current unemployment rate, stuck at around 14.5%. It has been above 13% for over a year now, since the end of 2009, nearly 2 years. And we can see then the period of practically full employment in Ireland, which lasted for about 7.5 years, where unemployment rate stayed around 4%, and 4% would be considered full employment, a situation where anybody that wants a job can find a job. You will always have some level of unemployment, be it for frictional reasons, as people leave one job and enter another, for structural reasons as certain industries decline, other industries grow. You will have cyclical unemployment based on seasonal patterns and changes in the economy, and at all times there will be some level of unemployment out there. But for 7 years in Ireland it stayed at around 4.5%, which will be considered full employment. We can see that previously the unemployment rate was even higher than it is now. So we have an unemployment crisis now, and the numbers unemployed are higher than they ever were. The actual unemployment rate was higher before, touching 17% back in the mid-1980s. A decline then up to the start of the 1990s, and then an increase in the early 1990s when there was sort of a jobless growth back up to 16%, and then from about the end of 1993 onwards it declined and declined quite rapidly right up to 2001. So this was sort of the Celtic Tiger phase 1, the output driven, export driven element of the boom, where there was huge increases in employment, and there were sustainable increases in employment. Employment did grow at even a much more rapid rate here. A lot of that was based on construction and the property markets, and that has to a large extent fueled the quite dramatic rise in unemployment that took place over a very short period of time. So previously, while unemployment has risen, it hasn't risen at the same rate as it has increased in the current crisis. So it went from 4% to 14% in a very short period of time. One of the issues here is that the number of construction sites that closed down at the same time, whether it was August or December 2008, the construction sites closed and simply did not reopen once the holidays were over. and thousands, tens of thousands of people became unemployed. If we look at a breakdown by sector in the Irish economy, we get a pattern such as this emerging. So this is again data from the CSO, and we can see that it does cover most of the intercensal period. So for April to June 2006, we can take it that the numbers are entirely accurate, but by the time we get to April, June 2011, remember that there's 97,000 people to be put into the population, and we can imagine that most of those will be in the population aged over 15 or over. It's unlikely the CSO haven't measured those aged under 15, as most of the increase here would be due to births, which they can track. But if you look at the different sectors, the different industries measured and tracked by the CSO, we're looking at the number of total in employment. So we can see this peaked in 2007 at over 2.1 million and is now down to about 1.8 million. So almost a 300,000 reduction in the number employed in just 4 years. If you look at some of the sectors where this drop has occurred, and again we focus on construction, 270,000 in April 2007, down to just over 105,000 now. So 165,000 jobs lost in the construction sector. Almost half of the drop in employment has been in the construction sector, and again most of that would be male. So the huge increase in male unemployment is driven by the construction sector. In a sector that might be considered to have a large female labour force, we can look at the retail sector, wholesale and retail, shops, etc. These peaked at nearly 310,000 in 2008 and is now down to about 265,000. So nearly 40 or just over 40,000 jobs lost in the retail sector over the 3-year period. Over the same time period, industry has also seen substantial job losses. So over 50,000 jobs lost in industry over the past 4 years. And indeed, if you look across all the sectors, in most sectors you will see that job losses have occurred. And in total you're looking at a reduction in more than 300,000 in the total employed over the past 4 years. There have been some sectors where employment has increased. If we look down towards the bottom of the table, we can look at education, which has gone from 141,000 in 2007 to 146,000 now. And also if you look at health, 210,000 to 237,000. So almost a 40,000 increase there. 30,000 increase there over the 4 years. The thing to note here is that these are sectors dominated by the state. So there has been increases in employment in some sectors, and losses and huge losses in the private sector, but very few or no losses in the public sector. Actually increases in the numbers employed. There has been efforts to control what's called headcount in the public sector, but most of the reduction has been achieved through retirement. In the education sector, there are increased demands being placed on the education system, primarily because of the number of births and young people in the country, that the growing population, in order to keep class sizes and staff student ratios at a reasonable level, there is demand for greater teachers. And again, the increased population does put increased demands on the health sector. Whether the increase in employment are fully justified is hard to know, but we can find some justification for them. And in the education sector, we can see in recent years that there has been a reduction in the numbers employed, but still only back to 2008 levels, and still ahead of where they were in 2007, where unemployment peaked. And if you look at unemployed, going from less than 100,000 in the years 05, 06, 07 to over 300,000 now. So a 200,000 increase in the numbers unemployed. There's a slight incongruity here in that the numbers in employment has fallen by 300,000 from 2.1 million to 1.8 million, whereas the number unemployed has only risen by 200,000 from 100,000 to 300,000. There's essentially 100,000 missing. There's a number of reasons why we can explain this. One we've mentioned is retirements, people who wouldn't be in the labour force. So you can see the numbers not in the labour force has increased in recent years. So as people are retiring, There could be people returning to education. Again, they wouldn't be form part of the labour force. And then, of course, you have people leaving the country, the return to outward migration, which has been particularly strong amongst non-Irish nationals, and anecdotal evidence suggests it's also strong amongst Irish nationals. So there could be a greater proportion of people who have lost their jobs and who have also left the country. So they'd appear in the reduction in employment figures, but wouldn't appear in the increase in unemployment figure, as they would have left the workforce and essentially left the country. Looking at unemployment, it does have severe costs from a public finance perspective. It increased social welfare expenditure, making unemployment assistance payments makes up about 1/6 of the overall social welfare budget. So it is quite a large payment to be made. Unemployment benefit, unemployment assistance, that which is typically described as the dole. And then there's also a loss of tax revenue, that if these people have gone from being employed, working, earning an income, they'd have been paying tax, and if they're now unemployed, they're receiving a transfer payment. So it does have very severe budgetary implications that needs to be controlled. And one of the best ways of doing so is to increase employment. Of course, at present we face a situation where the goals of macroeconomic policy of living standards, unemployment and inflation are being, in a sense, outweighed by the importance being placed on the public finances. But that's something we'll turn to before today's session is over. The third objective of macroeconomic policy is a low and stable rate of inflation. So looking at price changes, price increases. So you're looking for price stability. One common measure of price stability is the inflation rate, and which in terms of the European Central Bank target is a rate of 2% per annum. So that's what is defined in the ECB's terms as a low and stable rate. There are differences as to what the targeted inflation rate should be. If you're going to target the inflation rate, what is an appropriate target? There are some who suggest that 2% is too low, and that in fact what we need in the current environment is a greater target, a target of 3, 4 or 5%. But for the ECB, they target a 2% rate of inflation across the Eurozone. So the inflation rate is measured by the consumer price index and can be measured by different compositions of the consumer price index. But the CSO again measures the inflation rate like most official statistics in Ireland, most official economic statistics. So the CSO sends people around each and every month to collect around 45,000 prices relating to a basket of close on 1,000 goods and services. So the CSO gathers this data. So in some instances you can see people in shops with barcode scanners collecting prices. In other instances they ring for the price of different services, and also can collect prices from the internet. So the CSO collect these 45,000 prices, but they don't just then go and look at these price changes. They also look at how important the goods are. So if something has a huge price increase, if people don't buy it, it doesn't really feed into inflation. A price change in a good people buy an awful lot of will have a big impact on inflation. Inflation is designed to measure prices, and is also designed as sort of an approximation of cost of living. So it should in a sense reflect what it is that people purchase with their income. So the CSO then sporadically undertakes a household budget survey. So every couple of years they look at a group of households, a couple of thousand households, and ask them to track their expenditure. What exactly do they spend their money on? So track the quantity of goods they purchase, when they purchase it, and the most important aspect is the quantity, how much. And they use this then to weight the various expenditure categories. So how important should a particular good or a group of goods be in the consumer price index? And that's dependent on how much of the family income goes on these particular goods. So the CPI is a weighted index. So it's not just an average price increase, it's a weighted price increase, where goods that form a greater proportion of household expenditure have a greater weight than goods that form a lower proportion of household expenditure. So the data is generally presented in index form with some base year set equal to 100. So the base year can change, be it 2006, 2008, and in Ireland the index goes back all the way to 1922. So we have quite a long historical series of inflation in Ireland. So the inflation rate, that which is most oftenly quoted, is fairly easily calculated once you have the index. So P reflects the index value in any given period, the prices, and PT is the time period. So PT is the value of the index in the current time period T, minus PT minus 1. What was the index in the previous time period? So the price level in the previous time period divided by the price level in the previous period multiplied by 100. And that gives the inflation rate. So if the consumer price index now is 103 and previously was 100, it's pretty easy to work out that the inflation rate would be 3%. 103 minus 3 divided by 100 multiplied by 100 will come out at 3%. So you can work out the inflation rate if you have the current and previous value of the consumer price index. And the most commonly used measures are the monthly inflation rate, compare the current value of the consumer price index to what it was in the previous month, and the annual inflation rate. Compare the current value of the CPI to what it was 12 months ago. So you get monthly inflation and annual inflation, and much of the focus tends to be on the annual inflation rate, which gives us a comparison between current prices and what they were 12 months ago. So just like unemployment, there are costs of inflation. The biggest cost of inflation is that it reduces the purchasing power of money. That if you have a fixed amount of money and prices are increasing, well, clearly then you can buy a smaller and smaller bundle of goods as prices continues to rise. And this will particularly impact people on fixed incomes. So if you're on an income of €200 per week and there is price inflation of 3, 4, 5%, pretty quickly you can eat into your purchasing power. That if income stays at €200 but the price of the goods you buy is increasing, well, then your purchasing power is going to decline. There's a fewer and fewer amount of goods that you can purchase. Inflation can also erode international competitiveness. If the price of production in Ireland increases and the price of goods in Ireland increases, it'll make them less attractive for those in foreign countries to purchase them. So the impact on exports can be quite significant. It could be goods exports or tourism or a whole host of other areas that you can in a sense price yourself out of markets if there's large domestic inflation in your own country with very little inflation otherwise. And in phases of the Celtic Tiger we had issues with international competitiveness. Over the last 3 or 4 years it's actually been the opposite. Inflation in Ireland has been lower than it has been elsewhere. So there has been to some extent a restoration of international competitiveness. And also a very important consideration is the distribution effects that inflation has. If you are a saver, you don't want to see inflation. If you have money in the bank, you don't want prices to be rising. So if you have €10,000 in the bank and you want to buy a product or something for €10,000, if there's inflation that causes the price of that good to rise, well then you can't purchase it. So 5% inflation would see the price rise to 10,500. Depending on the interest rate you're earning on your money, you may now not be able to purchase the good you originally intended. So inflation reduces the purchasing power of savings. So savers suffer in periods of inflation. On the opposite side to that then, borrowers clearly want inflation. That if you have a loan of say 100,000 from the bank and your income is 20,000 a year, well then the loan makes up 5 times your income. But if over a period of a number of years there's widespread inflation in the economy and your income rises to 33,000, and assuming no repayments on the loan and just covering the interest, if your income rises to 33,000 because of inflation, the loan is still at 100,000, it's now just 1/3 of your income. So you've gone from a position where the loan is 5 times your income to 1/3 your income, and you might actually be in purchasing power terms be no better off. If prices and wages have risen by the same rates, you can still purchase the same bundle of goods. But when it comes to your debt, the real value of your debt has decreased. So if you're a borrower, inflation is beneficial to you. And this is part of the argument made that the inflation target of 2% is too low in the current environment because of the global debt crisis, because of the huge debt that was built up over a sustained period. That what's actually required is some inflation to erode the real value of this debt, to drive up prices and particularly wages, to try to ensure that the real value of the debt, the burden of the debt, is reduced. This would come at the cost of savers, who would see the real value of their savers fall, and also those in fixed incomes. Fixed income people particularly tend to be the pensioners who would have taken a pension annuity, a guaranteed fixed income for the remainder of their retirement. If there's widespread inflation, the value of those pensions can be harmed quite substantially. So inflation does have important redistribution effects. And it's not just simply a case of having inflation to inflate away the debt. There would be costs of doing so. When looking at inflation in Ireland, like unemployment, we can see that it has gone through periods of stability and gone through periods of high volatility. And some of the most dramatic volatility has occurred in recent years, where we actually broke through into negative territory for the first time in this data series anyway, back to the mid-1970s. So the inflation rate tipped negative, and tipped negative quite substantially, hit minus 6% towards the end of 2009, though a lot of that was driven by mortgage interest. Mortgage interest makes up about 7% of the CPI, so that is an important price. That if one price alone is 7%, and the ECB rate fell from 4.25% in mid-2008 to 1% in early 2009. So that drop, a huge drop in mortgage interest costs, led to a substantial drop in inflation. But we did have general price deflation in Ireland for a reasonably long period, 2.5 years, 2 years. The inflation rate was negative. It has edged back into positive territory recently and is now at around 2.5%. So the inflation rate has fluctuated quite wildly. We can see that again in the 1980s. Not only did they have problems of low growth, high unemployment, they also had problems of high inflation. So in the 1980s had all the problems conflated into one. An inflation rate of more than 20% per annum. That's prices doubling every 3.5 years. So that is not a stable price environment. Inflation rate then fell throughout the late 1980s, and for much of the 1990s the inflation rate was below 5%. And in fact, during the peak of the first phase Celtic Tiger, the inflation rate was remarkably low. One of the notable economic characteristics of Ireland was how we managed to have growth rates in excess of 10% per annum, but inflation rates of less than 4%. That we managed to grow the economy for a sustained period without overheating. A lot of this was because we were a labour surplus economy. We had very high unemployment as a relic of the 1980s, and there wasn't going to be much wage inflation. There was also, as we'll see in later classes, national wage agreements and other factors that led to the low inflation rate in Ireland. Then during the Celtic Tiger phase 2, particularly towards the end of it, you can see that the inflation rate began to tick up and was running at about 5% prior to the onset of the crash. So a 5% inflation rate was much higher than it was back in the mid to late 1990s. But then towards the end of 2008 it dropped, and dropped quite dramatically as the bubble burst, as as interest rates dropped and prices dropped. Oil prices also had a role to play. They peaked at $147 a barrel in mid-2008. They declined, and as the effects of the interest rates have been coming out of the annual rate of inflation, you can see we're now back to around 2.5%. A sustained period of deflation is not a positive thing for the economy, particularly one that is as indebted in Ireland. If inflation reduces the real value of debt, deflation increases it. If you're heavily in debt, you don't want to see prices, and in particular wages, falling, as it now increases the burden of the debt you're carrying. So a sustained period of deflation is not a desirable outcome. So the last element we'll look at in this introduction to the goals of macroeconomic policy is just two of the policy constraints, or the economic constraints, that the government and the economy faces. The first are real constraints when looking at the level of output the economy can produce. So the real constraints are in terms of the factors of production. So the factors of production being land, labour, capital and enterprise. Generally we take the quantity of land to be fixed, unless you're living in Holland. Enterprise is dependent on the entrepreneurial spirit and maybe investment and opportunities of the economy. And these are largely determined by the two factors of production that tend to get most of the analysis done on them, particularly in some of the models of economic growth, and they are capital and labour. So capital primarily the money for investment, and labour then the human capital, the human side to producing goods and services. So in Ireland we've had problems with having appropriate capital, having it targeted to appropriate areas. So rather than having the self-sufficiency, inward orientation outlook that we had for most of the first 40 years of independence, in the last 40-50 years there's been a very outward look. That we didn't have sufficient capital in Ireland, if we couldn't target the investment to the appropriate areas, we'd see capital outside of Ireland. So attempts to attract foreign direct investment into Ireland. And for most of our history, we've been a labour surplus economy. There hasn't been a shortage of labour. In fact, we've had labour surplus. That when the capital arrived, the workforce was there, available and ready. In the late part of the last decade, we did have a labour shortage, and hundreds of thousands of people did migrate to Ireland to avail of employment opportunities here. So the size of the labour force and the amount of capital available for investment can impact on how GDP can grow, can impact on how you can affect economic growth. These are key factors in determining the performance of an economy. What capital is available, how much is available, to whom is it available, and what can it do? And then do you have the labour force to meet the requirements of the capital investment? And one issue in Ireland when looking at enterprise, the last factor of production, is that maybe there had been too great a focus on attracting capital from abroad and attracting the investment from abroad, and too little emphasis on developing indigenous investment, indigenous enterprise, and providing capital for domestic companies, domestic startups. But there are some sectors now where this is turning around, particularly in the IT sector, where the value of domestic companies is being realised in a greater and greater fashion. On the financial side then, there are two key important considerations. One which has become as much a target as an instrument in Ireland, that is the fiscal deficit, and then we also have the balance of payments. So the fiscal deficit is basically the government accounts. How much money does the government collect and raise in tax revenue primarily over a given year, and how much money does the government spend in goods, services, public sector wages, transfer payments, interest and other expenditure items in the government. If expenditure exceeds revenue, as it tends to do, and definitely does so at the moment, the government runs a general government deficit. And over time, the cumulative general government deficit results in a national debt. That if you're running sustained annual deficits and you're funding those deficits through borrowing, over time then the deficit will increase. And as debts rises, governments accumulate foreign or external debt, borrow the money from abroad. So what you get is, as the debt gets larger and larger, the level of interest payments get larger and larger, and interest payments can account for a large proportion, not just income tax revenue, all tax revenue. So in Ireland, there's suggestions that we'll get to a position where by 2014 about 20% of government revenue will be going on interest expenses. This is lower than it was in the 1980s when it was 30%, but is a huge burden to carry. So the size of the debt forces the government to reduce debt regardless of the impact on unemployment. So while growth and unemployment are two of the key goals of macroeconomic policy, if the government accounts get out of whack for a while, they can in a sense become the target. That over a short to medium term, the target can be the fiscal deficit rather than the other goals of macroeconomic policy. And that's largely where we find ourselves in Ireland at the moment. That after a period of sustained government surpluses, in fact for most of the last decade the Irish government was a saver. Back in 2001 we set up the National Pension Reserve Fund with the promise to put 1% of GNP into this fund each and every year, and over a short period of time it built up a fund of close to 20 billion by the start of 2008. So we were running surpluses and we were saving some of those surpluses into the National Pension Reserve Fund. So you can see that the government budget in Ireland had very little impact on restraining policy over a sustained period. And in fact there are some who suggest that because of the healthy position the government finances were in, the taxes were set too low and expenditure was set too high. Then we should have had a greater buffer built up for the rainy day than we actually had. So we had the 20 billion National Pension Reserve Fund. As it turns out, most of this has been poured into the banks, but that was the main buffer we had, that our expenditure levels and tax levels weren't appropriate. And as soon as the economy hit the downturn in 2007, we went from having a surplus to one of the largest deficits seen in the world in a very short period of time. So by 2010, the deficit was at 32% of GDP, a deficit of almost 50 billion euro in 1 year. Now, to be fair, a large portion of that is due to the banking disaster, the creation in 2010 of some 30 billion of promissory notes for Anglo-Irish and Irish nationwide, added to the general government budget in 2010. But you're still looking at what we call a ordinary budget balance of 13 or 14% of GDP, of close on 20 billion euro in 2009-2010. The government was spending 20 billion more on goods, services, wages, interest than it was taking in, and this deterioration had occurred in quite a short period of time. So throughout the period from the start of the decade, there had generally been surpluses where revenue had exceeded spending, but we can see a huge gap opening up from 2008, 2009, and this has continued into 2010 and 2011. And if you look at the cause of the gap, you can see it seems to be split between the two, although the drop in the blue line, government revenue, is greater than the increase in the red line. So it's not so much that government revenue has suddenly increased at an accelerated rate since the downturn has taken place, it's that tax revenue has declined. And this is no more, or can be shown no more visibly than if we look at the performance of stamp duty. During the last decade, we had a construction and property boom, which not only created huge levels of employment in construction, also filled the state coffers with tax revenue, and tax revenue that turned out to be transitory, that wasn't sustainable, it wasn't permanent, and just as it was likely to increase at quite dramatic rates, it was also likely to decrease at quite dramatic rates. And this is best exemplified by stamp duty, a charge on transactions, buying and selling of particular assets. So stamp duty had been a part of government revenue, but a relatively insignificant part, up to about the year 2000. Then we can see that from 2002, 2003 onwards, it rose, and almost rose to 4 billion per annum. So a rise from a couple of 100 million to 4 billion in quite a short period of time. So huge sums were being generated through stamp duty, and it was the increase during this period here that in a sense funded the increase in government expenditure. So hiring of public sector workers, particularly wage increases for public sector workers, increase in social welfare payments, increase in capital expenditure, were primarily funded by the increase in tax revenue that came from the construction sector. But you can see that in 2006 it peaked, 2007 began to drop, and in 2008, 2009 it dropped at an alarming rate. So this was the key reason for the whole opening up of the public finances. Not so much that expenditure increased during the crisis, most of the increase that took place prior to that, but that tax revenue collapsed. If we look at where the stamp duty revenue came from, so stamp duty is broken down into 6 or 7 different categories, so we have 6 categories here. So you have stamp duty on land and property, that a conveyance you have to pay a particular amount of tax over to the state. Stocks and shares have a stamp duty. Companies pay a capital duty for limited liability. There's stamp duty on checks and credit cards. There's stamp duty on insurance contracts, and there was a temporary financial institution levy back in 2003, 4 and 5. But if you look for the increase, you can see that they virtually all took place in stamp duty for land and property. Based around the construction and property sector, that's what drove the increase in stamp duty revenue. So this got completely out of line with historical precedent and rose quite dramatically, but then fell as quickly as it rose. Went from over 3 billion a year to just a couple of 100 million. So a huge increase in a very short period, and a huge decrease in a very short period. So looking at just some of the different tax headings. So these are the eight main tax headings used in the Exchequer returns. So income tax, corporation tax, taxes on income, value-added tax, excise duty, taxes on consumption, stamps, capital gains and capital acquisitions tax, transaction taxes, and then customs duty, which primarily are EU customs duties collected in Ireland. As within the Eurozone, we don't have the ability to set customs and excise duties on intra-European trade. So if you look at the different tax heads, you can see where the drops have occurred. And in fact, all tax heads have dropped over the last number of years. Back in 2007, tax revenue was 47 billion. By 2009, it had dropped to 33 billion. So a drop of more than 14 billion in just 2 years. So we said a 20 billion hole open in the public finances. Well, almost 2/3 of that is due to the collapse in tax revenue. And this then continued into 2010, where less than 32 billion was collected. There is due to be an increase in tax revenue in 2011 due to some measures introduced in last year's budget, and also due to some reclassification issues. But if you look at the different tax heads, we can see income tax has fallen. As we looked at the employment situation in Ireland, the numbers working has fallen, so therefore the number paying tax has fallen. Corporation tax has fallen from about 6 billion to 4 billion. VAT has tracked the pattern of consumption, that as people have less and less money, as people have borrowed less and less money, and that people have become more and more cautious, the level of expenditure has fallen, so VAT has fallen quite substantially. Excise duty has fallen, excise duty on cigarettes, on fuel, on alcohol, on betting and other excise duties has fallen. But the biggest reduction can be seen if you look at the transaction taxes, stamp duty and capital gains tax. So huge drops over quite a long period. In fact, stamp duty was larger again in 2006. Capital gains tax, so if you have an asset and sell it at a profit, you have to pay over 20% of that profit to the state. And capital acquisitions tax, if you get an asset through inheritance or a gift, there may be some tax due. But if you look at the drop in the transaction taxes, stamp duty primarily those who are buying assets, and capital gains tax those who are selling assets, that's over 6 billion in 2007 and just about 1.3 billion in 2010. A drop of more than 4.5 billion. That has led to the huge gap opening up in the public finances, primarily based around the property market. And the loss of employment in the property market has led to the drop in income tax, and again the drop in the number of sales in the property market has led to drops in VAT. So VAT on property related materials, VAT on new houses, etc., has all led to a substantial drop in VAT revenue being collected by the state. So the impact of the property sector can be felt across the main areas. Look at the excise duty, which is based on consumption but is largely unrelated to the property market. We can see it's fallen, but the fall hasn't been as large. Proportionately it has fallen by a slightly smaller amount than the fall in VAT. So there has been an impact on all areas. So the drop in tax revenue has been substantial. If you look at the expenditure side and compare expenditure in 2007 to 2010, we can see the expenditure isn't that much greater. So if you say when did the gap emerge in public finances, it was 2007 when we run the last of our budget surpluses. In 2010 we're spending more, but not a huge amount more, and government expenditure has declined over the last number of years. Again, I'd be a bit cautious about how you'd interpret these figures. These are the figures taken from the Exchequer accounts published on a monthly basis, and these measure the opaque concept called net expenditure. So there is some elements subtracted from these in order to calculate net expenditure. So some receipts collected by the different departments are subtracted, and then these net expenditure figures are arrived at. If you look at the main areas of expenditure, health, social welfare and education, we can see the increase in social welfare expenditure over the last number of years as more and more people become dependent on the social welfare system. There's been a decrease in expenditure in the health sector, and the education sector largely remained the same. Again, down to the increased demands being placed in the education sector because of the increased young population. And then the other categories, all other expenditures, have shown some decline. When looking at government expenditure, it can be broken down into current expenditure, that's day-to-day expenditure, social welfare payments, wages, purchasing goods and services, keeping the lights on, electricity, and capital expenditure, long-term projects. And in recent years, any decrease that's taken place in expenditure has largely been focused on the capital side. So if you look at the capital budget, it increased because of, say, national development plans, building motorways, building new train lines, etc., building hospitals, schools, and other capital projects by the state, and has declined recently. The decline is a bit more dramatic than suggested because in 2009 there was a payment made to the banks that went under capital expenditure. But you can see the rise through 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the decline in recent years. In 2010 it has continued to decline. Current or day-to-day expenditure has risen, although the rise has moderated slightly as we moved into 2010. The mix of current expenditure has changed. One element of current expenditure is interest payments on the national debt, and these have increased in recent years. So the moderation in current expenditure has meant that as more and more money is spent on interest expenditure, there is less and less money being spent on the other areas: health, education, social welfare, etc. So while there hasn't been a drop in current expenditure, there has been a change in the mix. And the reason why the interest expenditures increase is because of the alarming increase in the national debt over quite a short period of time. So again, we can look just like unemployment, inflation and growth rates. The volatility has taken place in recent years, and with our national debt figure, our debt to GDP ratio, it has been growing at an alarming rate for the past number of years. So the debt, again, like most of the other variables, were worse in the 1980s. It peaked at a higher rate in the 1980s and then declined quite slowly throughout the 1990s. So the debt burden got smaller and smaller. One point to note is that this debt burden didn't get smaller because we repaid it. Whatever debt we were accumulating back in the 1980s because of the public finance crisis back then wasn't really paid off. The national debt stayed at around €35 million right through the 1990s. But what did happen is that the economy was going through dramatic and rapid growth, so that as a percentage of GDP, the debt burden was declining, and declined all the way down to around 25% by 2006. And in fact, if you take the assets that were in the National Pension Reserve Fund as offsetting, the net debt burden was below 15%. So we had a very small debt burden just 3 or 4 years ago. Then in the last number of years, as the huge gap has emerged in the public finances, as revenue has collapsed and expenditure has moderated slightly, this gap had to be funded by borrowing. And then of course we had the bailout of the banking sector, which required huge funds to be used to prop up our delinquent banks. This increased the national debt at an alarming rate. The key issue now when looking at Ireland and its national debt is whether this rate of increase can be moderated. Is this going to continue through the next 3-4 years and break through this 120%, which is often considered to be a threshold for debt sustainability? That if a country has a debt level of greater than 120% of GDP, it's quite hard to bring it back. That the interest payments suddenly become too large, and that meeting the interest has to be done with borrowing. And if this is the case, then the debt is just going to go into a spiral of increases and can't be dragged back. Most suggestions are now that at the moment Ireland will be able to drag back the increases and will be able to keep the debt below the 120% level and make the national debt sustainable. Now, there still remains doubt about this, but most official indications are that it will be kept below the 120% level. This contrasts to Greece, where recently they've announced that in 2012 their debt is going to reach 173% of GDP. Greek debt is unsustainable. It is far higher than Ireland's. While we have some hope of keeping below the 120% level, Greece has long blown through it and is heading for 170%. and because of the huge interest costs if they're going to carry this debt, they simply will not be able to reduce it. So a Greek default seems inevitable. In the Irish case, it's a possibility, but not an inevitability. The second financial constraint we'll look at is to do with the overall economy, and this is the balance of payments. Money flowing in and out of the country. Are you running a balance of payments surplus or deficit? Is there more money leaving or entering the country? So Ireland is a small open economy, so we engage in a large amount of trade and there are huge flows in and out of the country. So the balance of payments is a record of economic transactions with the rest of the world. So it's a record of our trade in goods, our merchandise trade, and our trade in services. And then it's a measure of flows of income in and out of the country, and then a flow of transfers, payments made for which nothing is expected in return. So maybe our development budget, or contributions to the EU which are made, and other payments that leave the country. If we look at the balance of trade in Ireland, this is probably one stat that has been positive right through the last 3 or 4 years. So in Ireland we've gone from running a trade surplus of close to zero to a huge trade surplus. This is monthly data. So you can see the increase during Celtic Tiger Phase 1. So this was the positive period of growth, where it was export-led, export-driven, increases in employment in industry, etc., increases in exports, that saw the balance of trade rise from about €1 billion a month to over €3 billion a month. So quite a substantial rise over a very short period. If you look at Celtic Tiger Phase 2, the construction-driven phase, you can actually see that the balance of trade declined from €3 billion a month to around €2 billion a month. This is because exports didn't grow by as much during this phase, and also because imports were growing. Imports of materials for construction, imports of consumer goods, and other areas that saw the balance of trade narrow. And then in the last 3 years, the balance of trade has shot up again, and is now approaching €4 billion a month. So this is one positive statistic in Ireland over the past 3 or 4 years. If you look at exports, you can again see that exports increasing during the 1990s and have been largely static since. Have been trending upwards over the past 18 months or so, but during the glory years of Celtic Tiger Phase 2, there was no real increase in exports. In a sense, we took our eye off the ball. The focus was very much domestic, on construction, building houses, rather than focusing on what we could sell to the rest of the world. So exports did decline. And if you look at imports, you can see that during the property failed boom, imports are increasing, and this is what caused the balance of trade to narrow. And with exports staying the same, as showing up here, so exports staying the same, and then imports rising, the balance of trade narrowed. Again, some of the increase in the balance of trade recently is because imports fell. But there has been some stabilization in imports over recent times. Looking at income flows, these are hugely important from an Irish perspective simply because of the size of them, the amount of money entering and leaving the economy. So from the balance of payments, we can see the two key investments income flows are investment income. So there can be remuneration, payment for employment, etc. But the key issue is investment income, earnings on investment, be it earnings on equity, earnings on debt. And the money flows in both directions. So the blue line reflects money leaving Ireland, and the red line reflects money entering Ireland. So it's not all necessarily money flowing out. The flow is in both directions. The issue is the gap, that more money leaves and enters. And this is why GDP and GNP are so divergent in Ireland, that when looking at GDP, the total measure of output produced in the country, and GNP, the total income earned in the country, you can see that the income flows into Ireland would mean that GNP would be larger than GDP. But these then are countered by the amount of money leaving the country, and this drags GNP about 20% below GDP. So the investment flows are huge. So you're talking quarterly data maybe 21, 22 billion leaving the country and 14 billion entering the country. So an 8 billion gap in a quarter. So quite a substantial gap. So the flow of income in Ireland is negative. So while trade contributes, and particularly the merchandise trade, contributes positively to the balance of payments, income flows contribute negatively. More money leaves the country in form of income, particularly income earned by the foreign direct investment. So the profits this investment earns in Ireland are repatriated abroad, and this is investment that flows into Ireland. Irish residents, companies in Ireland, Irish people with investments abroad. So it's not zero, but it is cancelled fully by the flow of income out of the country. If we just look at the crude numbers of the balance of payments going back over the last 10 or 12 years, so you can see the merchandise balance, the balance of trade, increasing up to about 2002, then decreasing during subsequent years, and has now increased again over the past 2 to 3 years. So contributing positively to our growth figures and the turnaround in the balance of payments. On the services side, we run a slight balance of services deficit, so we import more services than we export. This is largely to be expected because of the huge presence of multinationals in Ireland. They don't engage in the R&D in Ireland, so they import the patents and pay royalties and then export the goods. So the import of the royalty appears on the services side as money flowing out, and the export of the good appears on the merchandise side as money flowing in. We can see the large income deficit or outflow that occurs because of the repatriation of profits of the foreign direct investment in the companies here. So about 27 billion left the economy in 2010, when in fact far more left, perhaps more than 80 billion left. But once you balance it with how much entered the country, you get a deficit of around 27 billion. Then if you look at current transfers, these are quite small. So over the last 5 years, transfers have been negative. So our contribution to the EU budget, foreign aid, and other transfer payments have outweighed flows into Ireland. So benefits from the EU budget and aid to Ireland, whatever that might be, so these have been negative for the last number of years. After being positive before, where we were net beneficiaries of the EU, we're now likely to be net contributors. Then if you look at the overall balance in the current account, how much money is entering or leaving the country, we can see that in 2010 we ran a current account surplus for the first time in more than a decade. So a dramatic turnaround in quite a short period of time. Most of it driven by the improvement in the merchandise balance. Our goods exports have been increasing, and this has brought about an current account surplus. So what this essentially means is that although the economy is in severe debt and the government is borrowing at huge rates, Ireland was actually a net lender. There were 761 more that came into the country than left. We had money and could finance our debts completely internally. We didn't necessarily need flows of money from abroad to fund ourselves. This is a different position to the other bailed out countries in Europe, particularly Greece and Portugal, the other two members of the PIG, the PIG countries, that they run substantial balance of payments deficits. They don't have the level of exports that Ireland has, don't have the amount of money flowing in, and would have difficulty funding themselves. If all the money in Ireland, the savings in Ireland, could be channeled into funding deficits in Ireland, we could fund ourselves. So in Ireland we have a household sector that has a very high savings rate. The household sector has substantial pension savings. If that could be channeled to fund deficits in other parts of the economy, particularly in the government sector, it could do so without recourse to borrowing from abroad. So from a balance of payments perspective, there is reasonably positive developments in the Irish economy. There still are sectoral imbalances between maybe excess savings and too much high savings in the household sector, which is driven by paying down debt, and too high borrowings in the government sector. But hopefully over the next couple of years these imbalances will be evened out and a bit of stability will result to the Irish economy. So that's a look at the final two goals of macroeconomic policy: inflation and unemployment, and some of the recent patterns in Ireland, and some of the key constraints the economy faces. The real constraints of having enough capital for investment and labour for employment, And then the financial constraints, those faced by the government on the fiscal side, the government accounts, and faced by the economy as a whole through the balance of payments. So we'll leave it at that for this class, and we'll take it up from there next week.